We are back, and I'm thrilled to be joined now by Greg Stoker, former U.S. Army Ranger with a background in special operations and military intelligence. He is now an activist, political, and military analyst and host of the Colonial Outcast podcast, which I couldn't recommend more highly. Greg, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, hey, thanks for having me.
So, tell us a little bit more about your background. Why or where did you serve for how long? And I guess how did you kind of come to an anti-colonial perspective or a perspective that was critical of U.S. empire after your time in the army?
All right. Well, I mean, it's not a unique story. I joined the United States Army to get the heck out of wherever I was, and it was the easiest way to do it. Paid for college, stuff like that. I was never like a huge gung ho Captain America type, but I did go into the Ranger Regiment, which is a United States Special Operations unit, and I did 4 combat deployments to Afghanistan. Started off as kind of like an assault position. I was a fire team leader, and then I transitioned more into a human intelligence collection and analysis before I got out. And I think what I started really questioning what was going on when I got exposed to targeting kinetic strikes, i.e. drone strikes under the Obama administration. And there just really wasn't a standard of proof for who we were dropping in terms of kinetic strikes. If you're on the wrong contact list, it could be greenlit. As long as you didn't destroy infrastructure, it was good. You could be a baker who, had like 4th degree connections to like the Taliban or the Haqqani or proto-Islamic State. You were still going to potentially eat a missile. So that was problematic, and it didn't work. It was strategically stupid. And then I got out, started studying post-colonial studies and international relations, and it's been a 10-year journey to get to where I am right now. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, and that is part of what you bring to your analysis, particularly of what's happening in Gaza right now, that I really appreciate, because you talked about how under the Obama administration there really wasn't the scrutiny that have been there in terms of who the targets really were and what their ties were to terrorist organizations. But I mean, the United States Army looks practically I guess, buttoned up compared to what we're seeing in Israel.
Yeah.
And what is that contrast like? Even though you had those concerns as a part of the army, and then it's on steroids with how Israel's handling Gaza.
I mean, I will never be an apologist for U.S. empire, but like it's so bad we're looking, I wouldn't say good, but like all right. So when it comes, apparently Israel is supposed to be fighting a counterinsurgency, right? And since we brought the U.S. Army and the U.S. military into it, U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine is kind of effective. It was more effective in Iraq than it was in Afghanistan. Afghanistan had a major foreign fighter problem. So fighters were coming in from like Pakistan and Iran and other parts. So complicating the situation. But it's called COIN, counterinsurgency doctrine. And one of the main pillars of counterinsurgency doctrine is if you're an occupying force, there's an acronym called SWET MSO. It's sewage, water, electricity, academics, trash, medical safety, and other. And it holds that if you're an occupation of a people and all of those sectors aren't up to code, and you cannot live in a modern standard of living, people are going to want to kill you. So if you're looking at it, so we would try to protect all these sites. Hospitals, I mean, Obama signed off on essentially bombing a hospital in 2015 in Kunduz province. But aside from that, we didn't have the state policy of bombing hospitals. And, we'd protect roads. So if we look at Gaza, they've destroyed the sewage pipes. A lot of the J dams, the 2,000 pound, bunker buster bombs have a unclassed penetration depth of 6 feet of concrete, which isn't going to collapse a tunnel, a hardened tunnel 50 feet underground, but it will collapse sewer, water pipes, electricity. They hit power relay stations in October. So that's always been a problem. Academics, they've destroyed every college or university in Gaza. Trash, there is no trash. Everything's rubble. There's no civic infrastructure. Medical, there's like 1 to 2 trauma surgeons left in North Gaza. As a matter of state policy, they've gone and destroyed hospitals as much as they could while keeping their propaganda machine alive. Safety, there is no safety, and there's about to be a massive biological event any time now. So yeah, they actually destroyed our own counterinsurgency doctrine that we advised them on because it is somewhat effective. But no, they're just they're not even pretending to fight a counterinsurgency. It's just straight up ethnic cleansing to make Gaza Strip unlivable. So.
Right. And so, I mean, as you describe that counterinsurgency doctrine that the United States adopted and supposed, Israel, I guess, for some time had been trying to follow to keep up appearances. But I mean, I don't know, I'm being overly generous there. Like, that is an explicit doctrine because it's in the interests of the party there, whether it be the United States Army or Israel, like to basically control the way that they respond to something so that they can have some sort of victory. But when you abandon that and it's really just killing for the sake of it, that runs a fly, I would imagine, over some in, say, the United States intelligence community or in the military brass who are less ideologically genocidal and more interested in maintaining empire or power. We've noticed on the show how there's a difference in how, say, Lloyd Austin or Burns of the CIA talk, not that we hear too much from Burns, but approach Israel as it relates to how they've been handling Gaza versus how Blinken and Biden have stood so steadfastly behind Israel. Is that discrepancy kind of laid bare there?
Well, first of all, Lloyd Austin, it's kind of hard to gauge where he stands. He is a representative of the military. He will back the administration publicly, despite whatever he's saying behind the scenes. I mean, he does have a lot of problematic defense industrial or military industrial complex affiliations, but it's hard to get a gauge on what military officials are believing unless you have a line on the inside. I know that there's a lot of discontent, but there's also a lot of groupthink within the military. Even if there's isolated pockets of outrage, everyone's going to toe the line. That's why we've only seen like one major man from the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, resign instead of a whole onrush of people getting out, because people may disagree with it. But I remember being in that mindset. I wouldn't expect a lot of pushback or resistance. So in Burns, I mean, we know he's a diplomat. He's not really a spy master. He's trying to get this ceasefire deal done with parties that have both parties have positions that are unacceptable to the other. So
yeah, no, I am just fascinated, though, I guess, by the difference in terms of like what is in the strategic interest of the United States versus versus Biden's kind of what he perceives as the right thing to do in terms of supporting Israel being this inherently moral thing, or what it means for his reelection bid. There's a bit of a gulf there. You mentioned the ceasefire proposal. Let's talk a little bit about that. There's a lot right now in the press about back and forth about who has and who has not agreed to the ceasefire. We know that this basic framework of the ceasefire has been agreed to by Hamas for weeks, if not months. And they were in favor of the United Nations Security Council ceasefire that just passed. Israel was not. But we still then hear over and over from Blinken and other members of the White House that it's Hamas who is not agreeing to the ceasefire. Now, I think maybe that may have some more truth after the massacre for the hostage rescue, which we can get to in a little bit. Mm-hmm. But what do you make of that back and forth and how the United States is trying to present Hamas as the biggest obstacle to the ceasefire?
Well, of course they would. The one overriding goal is to provide political cover for Israel and to make them look as favorable as possible. I mean, before we get into the basics of the ceasefire, we have to acknowledge that from a strategic perspective, Hamas has achieved all of its objectives, putting the question of Palestinian self-determination and statehood back on the table, discrediting the deterrence capacity of the Israeli military and intelligence apparatus, which was destroyed on October 7th, and showing the world exactly what Israel was and getting the conversation about Palestine foremost in the global forum. So they've achieved all their strategic objectives, and Israel has achieved none of itself. None of it. First of all, it's going into pariah statehood. It's acting increasingly like a rogue state. They haven't freed all the hostages, which was one of their stated objectives. destroying Hamas and dismantling Hamas completely was one of their stated objectives, which is impossible. They would literally have to kill everybody in Gaza, and genocidal regimes don't last, so they can't do that. And so they're in an impossible position. What they're trying to do is, you remember during the Iraq War, President Bush flew in on the fighter jet, and there was the mission accomplished on the Eisenhower aircraft carrier. That is essentially what they're trying to do. They're trying to polish this massive foreign policy nightmare / turd to make it look like something that it's not, like an Israeli victory. Like, we've dismantled Hamas so much that October 7th can never happen again. Well, yeah,
and that's what the U.S. is doing too, right,
yeah.
Greg? In the sense that that's why they're trying to present it as if it's Hamas, that the Israel will end up having a victory because they get Hamas to agree to a ceasefire, even if it's not true at all.
Yeah, and so now they're trying to reframe this whole thing as Israel has degraded Hamas so much they're no longer a military threat, and now they're willing, now that they've achieved their pseudo objectives, which were never their objectives, they're now being gracious and presenting Hamas with this. But the thing is, Hamas doesn't need to accept it because they can keep fighting. According to Israeli intelligence veterans and like Mariv, Ynet News, their own intelligence officers say that they couldn't defeat Hamas before 2026. And personally, I believe that to be completely optimistic.
Right. Well, Hamas is recruiting, we know, right? And there are some insurgent Hamas fighters, I guess, in the north who have been giving Israel some grief. And so the hostage rescue operation, how did that play into the ceasefire talks? Because from Israel's perspective, that's Netanyahu and the far right getting to say, see, we need to continue this war, genocide, war, to release the rest of the hostages, when we know, though, the overwhelming number of hostages that were released were during the temporary ceasefire. They only rescued 4 in this instance and killed over 270 Palestinians. Now, there have been rumblings that the United States may have provided intelligence support for this operation.
We did.
Oh, we did. Okay. Yeah. So we provided intelligence support for an operation that saved 4 hostages and killed over 270 Palestinians as we're trying to get this ceasefire over the hump. Do you think that affected Hamas's position here? Because they probably are like, you guys are not honest brokers here. You just okayed this operation that was a slaughter.
Right. So no, it doesn't really affect Hamas's position at all, because even though Israel did this hostage rescue massacre, they got 4 hostages back. They potentially killed 3 other hostages in the hostage rescue operation, but I haven't been able to verify that. I don't think anyone has, but that's definitely a possibility. So they got the hostages back. Okay, so what's going to happen now? Hamas is going to change their tactics, techniques, and procedures around the hostages. They're going to go back into the tunnels, and no more hostages will be recovered through military action. So that's done.
Because they were in civilian homes, right, when they were rescued. Right. Okay.
Yeah, so they're not going to allow that to happen again. So basically, the only way to get the hostages back now, which is a major political pressure point, both internally and externally for the Netanyahu's administration, is going to be through diplomacy. That's the only way it's going to happen. So Hamas has shifted tactics from, doing more direct action combat operations to more booby trap IED warfare. So, which is more sustainable in a long-term a war of attrition, because they're not going to lose as many guys doing direct confrontations against tanks. So we dealt with that in Kandahar and Afghanistan, and you may get like 1-2 guys in an operation if you're lucky. But no, they're just going to have a lot less combat attrition now and be able to keep fighting for an extended period of time. Whereas the starvation and the immense suffering of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza will continue to mount and build pressure. So yes, the United States is trying to frame this as like all Hamas has to do is accept it, but they won't, because they don't have to, because they're in a strategically powerful position right now. And they may be degraded militarily, but they're still politically potent. And they won't agree to this current iteration of the ceasefire deal because it's not, the language is so vague on how Israel will be bound. And I think within the UN Security Council, there's 2 types. There's a non-binding and a binding resolution. And it's not binding on Israel. There's no coercive measures in place to force Israel to adhere to any of the action items in the ceasefire. And so why? And it's too vague. This is why Russia abstained, because they wouldn't agree to it, because they're like, they said, quote, the language is too vague. So the ceasefire is not going to happen at this iteration of the deal.
And that's also because it's so vague that it doesn't provide a timeline for Israeli troop withdrawal and it creates wiggle room essentially for Israel to go back into Gaza if they provide some sort of pretense for it, is my understanding.
Yes. One of the main points is they'll kind of withdraw outside of the population centers and stay on the periphery, but of course be able to respond anytime they choose to. And they'll also be able to limit freedom of movement because from different sections of Gaza.
Yeah. So in terms of Gaza, they are losing their internationally, but also we know that Hamas has been fighting back against them at least a little bit in parts of Gaza. Now, in the north, you have Hezbollah, and Netanyahu's government has signaled multiple times a desire to expand this war into the north against Hezbollah, into Lebanon, so that if they get out of the hornet's nest that is Gaza, right, where they are forced to withdraw because of the dire humanitarian situation and international pressure, how else can Netanyahu continue to remain in power? Well, maybe he can fight Hezbollah in the north. What is the status of that?
Okay, well, first of all, this ongoing narrative about taking the fight to Hezbollah and defeating Hezbollah is completely absurd, which I'll get to in a minute. But since October 7th, one of the things prior to October 7th, one of the things that's always kept Israel kind of safe from a military perspective is what we would call its deterrence capacity. The belief in it being the scariest military in the region, having the Mossad be this all-seeing, all-knowing, omniscient force, intelligence force. But the thing is about October 7th, it shattered Israel's deterrence capacity. We're hearing reports that Apache pilots were targeting Hamas militants in the Gaza envelope, not with military intelligence architecture, but from like WhatsApp groups with civilians. So it was incredibly embarrassing. In order to get it back, they have to defeat Hamas, which they can't do. It's just not possible. There's a whole new generation of fighters because they've created a whole new exciting acronym, WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. So I'm sure those kids are just going to let bygones be bygones. Right. But if they can't defeat Hamas, they can't defeat Hezbollah because Hezbollah is the most powerful non-state military actor in the world. They're orders of magnitude above Hamas in terms of like discipline, manpower, weapons, and equipment, because they don't have to operate in an open-air prison camp. They can. Not only that, it's that before this point, a lot of the Hamas fighters didn't have any combat experience. Well, Hezbollah's been fighting the Islamic State in Syria for a while now. So they've been doing what is now a low-intensity campaign over there. And so they are also professional soldiers, right? That's all they do. The 50,000 reservists that Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant want to send to the front to confront Hezbollah, they do what, 2 years work in the tech sector, and they're getting recalled to go fight against a professional military that has honeycombed all of its military assets in a tunnel system way more complex and fortified than the Hamas tunnels in Gaza. I mean, it's just insane. And plus, they already lost to Hezbollah in 2006. They were defeated before Hezbollah was as powerful as they are now. And what the war in Gaza has showed us is that Israel, when we look at the operational autopsies conducted by war colleges in the United States, like out of Fort Leavenworth and stuff, the IDF has literally not updated their military or tactics at all. So there's no point that this campaign can succeed. All Israel will do is bomb Beirut and the Bekaa Valley, put pressure on civilians to try to pressure Hezbollah. But it didn't work in 2006. It didn't work in 2014 during Operation Protective Edge, and it's not working in Gaza because collectively punishing civilians doesn't affect military operations when it comes to asymmetrical warfare. It never has. There's no historical precedent for it. So even if you're like, why doesn't Hezbollah just care about the civilians? It's like, okay, well, that's not what we're talking about. From a strictly analytical point of view, it won't affect Hezbollah at all. But that's the core doctrine of the Israeli military. It's to punish civilians, to pressure militants.
And then, in terms of Hezbollah also getting emboldened, what are the possibilities of other states seeing funding Hezbollah and potentially their attacks on the IDF as a way to weaken the United States' standing in the region, and particularly its soft power as it relates to diplomacy in the Middle East and beyond?
Well, I mean, look, American soft power has been hit not just with this war in Gaza, but also the debacle in Ukraine. So, yeah, this does challenge American soft power. But I do want to talk about American escalation within the region, especially in Iran, despite like defense, like war hawks such as Lindsey Graham and Nikki Haley, who basically just say, are wind-up toys saying, bomb Iran, hit them hard. The establishment actually doesn't want that. If we look at the drama that's played out between the United States and Iran since the beginning of this year, everything points to the U.S. State Department and Department of Defense not wanting to escalate. So a few American soldiers were killed on an airbase in Jordan, and so how do we respond? By waiting 5 days, telegraphing to Iran that we were going to strike IRGC targets in the Levant. It was like, hey, Iran, we're going to bomb you. Watch out. You can't hurt Americans. And then we conducted 85 strikes, hitting mostly empty warehouses. And then after Israel destroyed the consulate in Damascus, what did the U.S. say? We will not get involved in a regional war. So we helped them defensively take down some of the Iranian ICBM or medium-range ballistic missile interceptions, but that's it. And then Lloyd Austin said yesterday, apparently according to Water Cooler Talk, that the United States is not interested in an escalation in Lebanon because we don't have the staying power. First of all, the complications in Russia, and now a potential flashpoint in Taiwan. A lot of people within the command echelon in the United States are saying, like, we don't want to go back and get involved in another forever war in the Middle East. We have other strategic interests that are going to test our staying power as it is.
And the Biden administration wants to pivot to Asia. I mean, and they have for a while. That was part of, I believe, the reasoning behind the Afghanistan withdrawal. But it makes this policy towards Israel so anachronistic, except when you take into account Biden's ideological Zionism. Now, you mentioned there a little bit about how it became extremely obvious that the United States is uninterested in backing a wider war, whether it be with Lebanon or, I mean, even with Iran, for example. To Israel's deterrence, you touched on this a little bit before, but these 9 months and also the signal that the United States won't back them if they choose to go after other actors in the region, does that signal a shift in the collapse of kind of Israel's presentation of itself as a mighty military power in the Middle East?
I mean, I don't see how they reestablish their deterrence capacity, because they can't defeat either of their two main adversaries in which they're engaged in combat operations with. And while they're trying to reassert their deterrence capacity, they just did a targeted assassination. It was apparently it was a bomber strike on Sami Abdullah, which was like essentially a brigadier general in Hezbollah, which is a significant target, but it's not going to significantly degrade their operations. So I was just reading Jerusalem Post today and Times of Israel, and they're doing a lot of COPE articles about how, like, now that they've taken out a senior Hezbollah official, Nasrallah is scared that he's next, and so they won't escalate. It's like, well, Hezbollah, even though you've killed one of their senior commanders, they are not going to escalate and open up a front. Iran doesn't want it. They don't want it. Hezbollah is a political entity that has a reputation for pretty good governance, and they know that if a front opens up, the people that they're responsible for in southern Lebanon are going to get hit hard. So that's their first responsibility. And so they're conducting escalation management on the northern border. So maintaining military pressure, taking out military sites, because they've confined their operations to military targets like sensor relays, intelligence outposts, Iron Dome batteries. They just took one out. It's $100 million of our tax dollars down the drain because we're going to have to replace it. Awesome. And then, and Israel has incrementally retreated from the north, creating this no man's land buffer zone between the north and south Lebanon. And so, yeah, Hezbollah is probably just going to keep doing that. They're not going to escalate this. I think they've proven that, because this is not the first time that the IDF has taken out a Hezbollah official. So I don't think their stance is going to change at all, because what they're doing is effective. It's incredibly effective, and they don't need to have Beirut get bombed to achieve their strategic goals and their operational goals. The only one who's going to escalate this is Israel. I personally hope they don't. I keep saying I don't think they will, but they're becoming more and more a rogue actor.
Yeah. I mean, I hope they don't for everybody's sake, but we have no reason to believe that they won't. Their behavior, I think, we've played this clip by Israeli historian Ilan Pape saying that this is the beginning of the end of Zionism, but that Zionism will the end will be extremely bloody, and the tunnel is quite long to getting to that point. Do you see that from a military standpoint, based on what you've said about their deterrence and how they've lost so much recently?
I mean, they can continue to keep bombing things and, wasting artillery shells on rubble, but there's a global supply chain shortage in RDX and HMX, and we're already using our own stockpiles for wartime deterrence and contingency operations to support Israel. So there are it might seem, just because we're this massive empire that can build a bunch of bombs, there are still realities. It's not limitless. So they have a munition shortage, not just in offensive weapons, but in defensive missile intercepts for the Iron Dome. So I don't see how they can. This party can't last forever. Plus we're still trying to support Ukraine, and that front demands so many munitions. Sometimes they shoot 10,000 howitzer shells a day. So what this is really doing is testing United States staying power, and we're losing a lot of soft power, because it seems like the only way that the United States does business and deals with problems is to sell more guns, weapons, and ammunition. But everybody who's in the know knows that there's just a shortage of literally RDX explosive materials. So that's another thing people aren't taking into account. So we can't keep sending weapons.
Well, that brings me really to my last question for you, Greg, which is that the diplomacy that is being done is, in my view, disastrous as it relates to the Abraham Accords, because the United States is continuing a Trump administration policy to push through normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and offering a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia, which also could potentially mean, according to some reports, that Saudi Arabia could be allowed to develop its own nuclear weapon, but even if not, could be some arms deals for Saudi Arabia. What's your view of the Abraham Accords and why the administration is pushing so hard for this, even though clearly it seems like it's I almost wish casting more than anything?
Well, I think people in the administration are starting to notice what Saudi Arabia is doing, and they're concerned about losing our greatest strategic ally, or at least having our greatest strategic ally play both sides of the field. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, I think a few weeks ago, publicly accepted an invitation to Tehran, for the first time in 20 years. Right. I think they're starting to put in plans, if they haven't already, to start selling oil in the yuan. So, the monopolization of the Gulf states is something that we are losing. And what I say is we, I mean the American administration and foreign policy apparatus. I don't want to say we because I don't agree with it, but yeah, there's definitely a noticeable shift towards a multipolar as opposed to a Western unipolar world order right now. And yes, we could give Saudi Arabia nukes, but will that change their massive strategic interests? Like, I think more cooperation with BRICS and other players and the de-dollarization, the push towards eventual de-dollarization is a potent deciding force within their own policy.
Well, Greg, I really appreciate your time today. Couldn't recommend Colonial Outcasts enough. We'll put a link to your podcast and your socials and stuff in the description wherever people are listening to or watching this. Thanks so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.